Hello, this is Jack Zenger, and I'm here with my colleague Joe Folkman,
Hello.
and we are here today to talk with you about a new technology to help leaders go to the next step in developing strengths.
Well, that was a short title, but well,
Yeah, right.
you know,
That's the whole webinar right there.
we got it there. But you know, one of the themes that we have talked about, and I think I don't know, kind of a phrase to live by here at Singer Folkman is better leaders, better results. And oftentimes I'll ask organizations, does your organization need good leaders? And everybody says, yes, we need good leaders. And usually when they say that to me, I go, I disagree. So let me show you some summary data here. If we as we do research about leaders, we found there's a connection between the effectiveness of leaders and outcomes. And if you think about a series of outcomes like profit, customer satisfaction, engagement, discretionary effort, and sales, and if you think about poor leaders, good leaders, and bad leaders, what we find when we look at the data is that if you look at poor leaders, good leaders do better, but great leaders do about twice as good. And if you look at that across profit, customer satisfaction, engagement, discretionary effort, and sales, you find exactly the same story. And as you think about that, I don't think there's an organization that looks at that and says, yeah, we need the good leaders. No, no, no. What people say is we need great leaders. And it wasn't until Jack and I started to look at the great leaders that we discovered some unique and really different aspects of that. Now, another way we've looked at leaders is if you work for a really bad leader, and I've asked people this question, if you work for a bad leader, would that make you bad? And most people say, heck no. I mean, if I work for a bad leader, that doesn't mean I'm going to be a bad leader. But we did some research where we looked at a leader's effectiveness and the effectiveness of the direct reports that work for them. And what we found is that if your leader is a terrible leader at the bottom 10%, you as a leader, your average effectiveness, and this is based on 265 leaders, their average effectiveness would be at the 29th percentile. And then as you see it go up, if you work for a great leader, somebody who's in the top 10% as a leader, then their direct reports would be 25% above average at the 75th percentile. HBR wrote an article that we gave them on this, and they called it the trickle-down effect, and you can find that online if you'd like. It's an interesting article, and it's one of our most read articles. But the point we're making here is leadership behavior is contagious, and the better you are as a leader, the better the outcomes, and great leaders make a great difference.
All right, I know that this will come as a shock to some of you, but I'm not a millennial. I've been doing this work in the leadership development world for about 65 years. As I think back on my earlier career, our first goal was to help leaders who were not either at all prepared for the job they were about to undertake, or those who were not doing very well, and helping them to kind of get to a position where they wouldn't be perceived as being bad, and we hoped that some of them would become, relatively good. We believed that the major problem to overcome were their weaknesses. The significant weaknesses and helping to kind of remove those was the overall key to improvement. So the process was pretty simple. We would do something in the way of assessing each leader. We would help them to spot their faults, their flaws, their flat sides. And then we would work to create a plan to improve those weaknesses. And again, all that was based on the assumption that a leader's weaknesses hold them back from being, an adequate or a good leader.
I remember meeting with a group and of senior leaders, and they said, Can you fix those guys? And I think, what about you guys? But that really was the focus. It was the kind of what are the bad leaders? Who are the bad leaders? Let's fix the bad leaders. After 25 years of doing that, Jack and I discovered a better way, a better approach. And the approach that we discovered was we started, I still remember this, Jack. I remember you talking to me one day and said, we ought to look at strengths. You remember that?
Yeah, I do. I do.
So it was your idea.
Yeah, right.
So Jack said we ought to look at strengths, and I said, well, so what's a strength? And we said, well, it would be a competency at the 90th percentile. So top 10%. This is not sort of above average. This is top 10%. This is something you're spectacular at. And so what we did was a study where we looked at 2,000 leaders, and we looked at the number of strengths that they had, and then we looked at their overall average effectiveness rating. And what we found is if a leader didn't have any strengths, if they were in the bottom 10%, their average effectiveness rating was the 34th percentile. Now, suppose that we were measuring 19 competencies, and suppose that you were really good at just one of the 19. What would you suspect that sort of being good at one, what kind of effect would that have? And most people, when I ask them that, they say, well, yeah, obviously the overall average is going to go up. And then I say, well, how much? And they say, well, 1/19th at least. That isn't much, is it? And so when you think about that, people expect a little increase. But when you looked at the data, what we found is that people with one strength, their average effectiveness actually went up to the 64th percentile. So you're in the bottom third with no strengths. You do one thing well. You're really good at one thing, and all of a sudden you go from the bottom third to 14 points above average. Just with one thing. And if you're good at three things, your overall average effectiveness rating went to the 81st percentile. Boy, you remember first seeing this data, Jack?
Yeah, it was very stunning.
I mean, this blew us away. We thought about that, and we thought, boy, we've spent 25 years telling people to fix their weaknesses. And by the way, we will say that in a third of the 30% of the cases, that's still the right thing to do.
Right.
Some people have a significant weakness or a fatal flaw. But in 70% of the cases, people are better off focusing on their strengths. I mean, if you think about the philosophy people had, if you said, well, how would you get to the 81st percentile? Now, that weakness-based philosophy is centered around the assumption that you're only as good as your least positive trait. So if you have 19 things you're working on, you figure out which is the worst one, you improve it, you work on it, and then you measure again and figure out which is the worst one, you move it, and so over time, you move up these 19 things up to the 81st percentile. That's one way to get to the 81st percentile, be really pretty good at 19 things. That's option A. What's option B? Be good at 3.
Develop a few good strengths.
And, the question people said was, well, which ones? And that was a really good question because, we asked the question, well, are there some of those that would do more than the others? And what we found is, didn't matter. Any 3, you get to choose. And that was amazing. Now, we've looked at the same study with 100,000 leaders. The numbers are almost exactly the same. They just vary by a few percentage points. So we found this is consistent data over time.
So let's just summarize. The fundamental message is you don't need to be perfect on every competency in order to be a truly extraordinary leader. It is not the absence of a weakness that makes a leader extraordinary, but it is, in sum, it is the presence of a handful of strengths. So let's just then proceed and talk about, are all approaches to strengths the same? Uh, yes, some people can use their natural strength to succeed. The assumption is that we're kind of all born with some things that either we acquire or genetic, or that we acquire at a relatively young age. And if a person can identify those capabilities and use them in their everyday life, they will be much more effective and successful. Now, we believe that it doesn't stop there, however. We believe that people have the choice of selecting a quality, a capability that they want to excel at, and that through perseverance and diligence, they can acquire that behavior at a very high level. We believe that that can also be driven by what the organization needs them to do, that the organization often has real expectations of one of their key people. And if that person is you, it's important that you acquire that skill. We believe you have the ability to make that conscious choice of becoming really effective at that competency. It happens by practice and using the right approaches that can be acquired.
You know, this whole issue raises, these new questions for us. When we started to think about this idea of strengths and developing strengths, the question was, well, how do you do that? I mean, we knew how to fix weaknesses. We've spent our careers helping people fix weaknesses, but is the method the same or is it different? And let me illustrate that with a kind of what we call a linear development example. And if you think about how to build a strength using this linear logic, you have your current performance and then you have the desired future performance. So you suspect that you're not very good at technical expertise and you want your colleagues to be confident in your expertise. And so what you need to do is do things more, better, faster, smarter, quicker. So you need to kind of, how do I improve? And to illustrate that example further, if you think about technical expertise and you say, well, what could I do to be better? And you'd say, well, if this was a weakness, then you could take a class or read a book or subscribe to a journal. And we agree that those things would be helpful. If it's a weakness, those things would make you better. And let me just illustrate that a little bit by walking you through, if you had used the linear approach, technical expertise, you'd just take more classes or read more books or subscribe to more journals. And you say, well, is that really going to help? Is that going to help us to be better? And I don't think it is. I don't think that works. In fact, we know it doesn't work. And the idea is, what did leaders with profound strengths do that average leaders did not do? So we started to ask that question, and what we did is to answer that question, we went to the data. And the data really pointed out a few interesting things to us. We looked at thousands of cases. We had mounds and mounds of data. And we started to look at leaders who were very skilled in technical expertise. And we said, well, were they good at some other things? And then we looked at leaders that were bad at technical expertise. And were they not skilled at those things? And were there something that enabled them to have more strength? So it was through this analytics of thousands of cases. And when we looked at one data set, then we look at another data set. And we go through 3 to 5 data sets for each one of the competencies. What we started to discover is these, what we call companion competencies, competency companions. And again, this is based on thousands of leaders. It's not based on Jack and I's good judgment or our intuition, but it's based on data. And we examined thousands of cases, and based on that, we created this process. And since the one was called linear, we called this nonlinear. And this is an example of the companion behaviors for technical professional expertise. And what you see here is 8 behaviors. And what our research found is that when we looked at people that were really highly skilled at technical expertise, they tended to be good at solving problems. Now that's kind of intuitively obvious, isn't it, Jack?
Mm-hmm. Yep, that was obvious.
You'd guess that, people who are technical experts, but they can't ever solve a problem, right? And you think, well, if you could actually take your knowledge and apply it, that would be more helpful, right? Yeah. The next one was interesting, relationship building. Think of someone who's a technical expert in your organization.
Yeah.
Are they good at relationships? Think of an engineer that's an amazing engineer. And, what we found, and we found this wonderful research. After we did this research, we found a lovely piece of research that's actually 26 years old. I mean, it was a Harvard Business Review by Kelly and Kaplan, where they looked at the best scientists, the best engineers at Bell Labs. And 26 years ago, Bell Labs was full of the brightest, most capable people in the world. I mean, they had more Nobel Prize winners there than any other organization. They had brilliant people. But they looked at the productivity of these researchers, and they identified what they called the stars. And when they looked at the differences between, the average performers and the stars, they found a series of factors. And one of those factors was building relationships. But actually, they also found taking initiative was one of those factors. They found that team effectiveness, and we call it, can be trusted to be acted in the team's best interest. That communication, they called that show and tell, and organizational savvy, or the ability to solve problems. So we connected on 5 of those behaviors that we found the same results that really validated this research for us. And what we're finding is these enabling behaviors help a person to grow and develop as a strength.
Kelly's work was published in this book, How to Be a Star at Work, and it really was the seminal piece of research on that led us to kind of this kind of thinking that said, okay, if the very best scientists of Bell Labs weren't there because they had degrees from the most prestigious university or because their PhDs were the most recent or that had more citations, but was for a set of different factors, that's really worth paying attention to.
I love the quote in that article where they said, we couldn't tell a difference on intelligence. They were all smart.
Yeah, they were all very, very smart. Well, and years ago, I used to do some consulting work with Bell Labs, and they were all really smart people. So what's strong and what's very helpful about this notion of companion competencies was the fact that it provides now the manager with some alternative ways to build their strengths. Just as an athlete who wants to be a really outstanding runner decides that there are some other things that he or she can do to help them be more, kind of agile and have more stamina and have more aerobic capacity and have strength. Cross-training really does provide some alternative ways to help them gain even greater capability. And so we recommend when people decide they want to get good at something that they focus on maybe 2 or 3 of these companion behaviors and choose the ones that kind of fit them and their personality, what they're kind of passionate about doing.
Yeah, some people, when they look at the companion behaviors, they say, you mean I have to be good at all 8 of those things? And it's no, we found that if you focus on just 2 or 3, it can really make a difference.
So the question is, how do these competency companions really work? And the honest answer to this is we're not sure, but we do have some theories, and so let us share with you at least 4 or 5 of our ideas about why they work. The first one is that the companion or the competency and the companion behavior often fit together because people perceive them as logically kind of aggregating. Years ago, there were 3 psychologists who conducted a very classic experiment in which people were asked to indicate the relationship among 64 different behavioral traits. The researchers kind of found that various traits cluster together in groups. That is, if I have quality A, then people are very likely to believe I also have quality B. So, for example, they found that the following traits tended to kind of combine together. People were perceived as being honest and also tended to be perceived as being modest. So honest and modest went together. If they were perceived as being very intelligent, they were perceived as being very, very serious. If they were perceived as being irresponsible, they were also perceived as being kind of wasteful. If they were perceived as being stern, they were also kind of perceived as being critical. Now, you and I both know that someone who's intelligent could also be wasteful. Someone who's
arrogant could be honest.
Exactly. So these don't have to be together, but the fact of the matter is that in most people's perceptual frameworks, there are some things that just plain go together. That's one explanation for how competency companions work.
You know, a second explanation is that a competency companion facilitates the expression of the behavior associated with that competency. So there's a linkage between interpersonal skills and technical skills. Several years ago, a friend of mine, Larry Inks, he went to a conference, Psychological Association conference, and he went to a presentation there. And some data was presented that sort of conflicted with some of the things that we'd written, Jack. And Larry came home. He made a copy of the presentation, and he sent me the data. Now, what's interesting about that is that it was my relationship with Larry that facilitated him making me smarter and getting me the presentation. And you think about that, and again, we've already covered this, that's one of there's a correlation, or one of the companion skills between technical skills is interpersonal. And so that's an example, that was an example for me personally, how having a good relationship with Larry helped me get some information. And you can think about all the scientists. You know, the classic scientist is the nerd that sits in the corner that doesn't talk to anybody. He doesn't have any friends going to conferences that feed him information, or she. I mean, that's the idea there, that those relationships facilitate. I always said, what's better than one really smart engineer and 2?
The answer is 2. Okay, the third explanation for why competency companions work is that by achieving a very high level of skill in one behavior, that helps to develop this related behavior. And again, I go back to this metaphor of athletic cross-training. What does lifting weights have to do with playing golf? What does running have to do with being a more effective swimmer, or vice versa? Swimming have to do with running. And the answer is that getting better at one of those often creates the likelihood of a greater skill in the other. So it increases flexibility, it increases strength, it increases aerobic capacity. Those getting good at one just simply helps to be better at the other.
Another thing that impacts this or makes these competency companions work is a competency companion is a building block or a core element to the desired competency. there's a woman by the name of Sharon Watkins, and Sharon Watkins used to work for a company called Enron. Sharon Watkins was reviewing some spreadsheets and looking at some data. Things didn't add up. So Sharon went to her supervisor and said, something's kind of screwy here. What's going on? And da-da-da-da. And in a short period of time, Sharon discovered that they were doing some illegal accounting.
Cooking the books.
Yep. And guess what happened to Sharon? She got fired. Now, the question is, was she the only person in Enron with integrity? Well, she was one of the only people at Enron that combined integrity with assertiveness. And, you'd say, well, lots of people there would say, well, that's the wrong thing to do, but I'm not going to say anything. And then what you start to do is question their integrity. What we found when we did companion behavior research, we found one of the companion behaviors associated with integrity was assertiveness. And what it is, it's that ability to speak up and raise your hand and say something's wrong. And it's one of the skills that helps you demonstrate your integrity. And so you can see how those two work together.
The fifth explanation is an intriguing one as well, that we wonder if the competency companion doesn't change the context in which all the activity occurs. For example, we found a very strong relationship between a person's ability to communicate and the extent to which that person is trusted. Typically, when people attempt to improve their ability to communicate, they very much focus on the message, how it's delivered, the presentation, the words being used, the media being used to present it. What we found, though, from our analysis was that it was maybe the ability of the person to listen that became a powerful factor in them being more trusted. That catch became more important than pitch. And that listening has a greater impact on the perceived effectiveness of the person as an excellent communicator.
The last one that we talked about was that developing a competent companion changes the person. So many of us have had the experience of developing a new skill and observing the interesting side effects. Learning to play golf helps a person increase confidence. Regularly exercising makes a person feel less stressed, and accomplishing a challenging goal causes depression to go away. One of the fascinating things we found associated with the strengths movement, Freudian psychology would suggest that the way you help people to improve is you've got to go through and understand all the terrible things that's happened in your life. But some psychologists have just found that helping people have success experiences makes their depression go away. And so what we see about these is that there's lots of things that by changing these companion behaviors, it actually changes the person. So the question always did is we first started to do this research, we thought this was a great theory. It was a really good theory. But do we have any evidence? Do we have any evidence? And one way to test this is to do a pre-post test, is to look at some people when we first gather data and get results, and then 18 to 24 months later, look at the effect. And so we had a group of 882 leaders. We identified 157 of those leaders that made a significant improvement on inspires and motivates others. And then we examined the data from these individuals to see if there was a link between the companion behaviors and the competency. So these are the 10 companion behaviors. You can see them on the chart there, the bubble chart that shows, inspires and motivates others, and then the 10 companion behaviors associated with that. And so what we did is we took the 157 leaders, We looked at their pre-test, the results from that they took on the first round, and on average they scored at the 33rd percentile, and then looked at the post-test results, and they'd moved to the 73rd percentile. Now we measured inspires and motivates others. Those were 3 behaviors. We looked at the other 46 behaviors and compared the pre-test to the post-test results. And again, we're showing you that difference. Again, in the pre-test, these people were in the bottom third. And in the post-test, they had moved into almost the top quartile, the 73rd percentile. That's a huge shift from the pre-test to the post-test results. So how did they accomplish that? Our theory was that to improve the competency, and this is a particular competency, when you challenge people, be more inspiring.
What do I do?
They just scratch their head. They don't know what to do. But the companion behaviors give them some very precise actions they can take to improve. Now, the first thing we did is we looked at the top 25 behaviors that had the biggest difference between the pre and post-test results. What we found is 22 of the top 25 behaviors that had a shift between the pre and post-test results connected to 9 of the 10 companion behaviors. And actually the 10th companion behaviors were in place 26, 28. Okay, so it was still there, but it wasn't part of the top 25. And so you can see that shift, and it's apparent from this, the shift in effectiveness could be attributed to the shift in all these behaviors. And as you look at the 10 companion behaviors and the pre-post score on all those 10 companion behaviors, you see those significant shifts on all those companion behaviors. Now, once again, we didn't ask people or suggest that people work on all 10. We suggested they work on 3 of the 10, but across those different people chose different ones to work on, and we saw the shift in those. And so we are very confident that our theory is correct. We are very confident that this is a way for people to build a strength. In fact, in our humble view, this is the only IP we know of, the only intellectual property we know of that gives people insight into how to build a strength.
Well, it's insight, and it's also more options. It's alternative pathways, which I think we all appreciate having, because maybe the linear approach may not be all we need. So let's just kind of summarize where we are. We have prepared a competency companion development guide. We have analyzed some 50 competencies, and we do lots of custom work for various clients, and so we have data on competencies that are not ones that we've measured in our traditional kind of standard 360-degree feedback instrument. So clients who have their own 360-degree instrument or have unique competencies, if they choose, they can use our strength-building insights to help them and to help their leaders in their company become ever more effective. Each competency, each of these 50 competencies, is defined. It also has a list of linear development suggestions. We don't want to send the signal that linear development is a bad thing. It's a very good thing. And if people haven't exhausted the linear solutions, they need to kind of look at them and see which ones apply. And especially if they have a low score on that competency, the linear solution is often the best. But the Competency Companion Development Guide now kind of provides the next step. And so we show the individual using this guide the 8 to 13 companion behaviors. So for every one of those 15 capabilities or competencies, they now can see, okay, what are the companion behaviors? So now that are statistically significantly correlated with that competency. So it isn't a matter of just doing anything, just doing something. It is a specific set of behaviors that are really connected to getting good at that competency.
And after that, one of the things we know from our research is that in order to change, what a change goal needs to move from kind of a general sense, like I want to be better at problem solving, to a very specific set of actions that would lead you to that. So what we did to understand that is we did more research. And I remember a meeting Jack and I were in with a client, and the client says, you know, we have these books where we have 10 developmental suggestions. And I remember Jack looking at them and he said, do you know what would be better than 10 developmental suggestions? And they said, what? He said, 3 really good ones. And that was our goal here, was to find 3 really good ones where we had data and research to back it up. And so what we try to do is take some kind of a general idea like solving problems, and then give you 3 specific suggestions about what you could do to actually improve around that. Now, what we found that these help people do is really get down to the nitty-gritty of specifically what you're going to do. So we show you solving problems and building relationships. Now, so what? So what's the results from all of this? Well, based on a research that we did on 4,216 leaders where we did pre and post-test analysis, we found that using this nonlinear approach, 85% of the people that used this approach were able to improve 1 or more of the competencies. And you know what we're finding is that this really does make a significant shift. A lot of times when we get to the end of a course and we say what really was helpful, one of the things we hear in every one of our courses is that nonlinear suggestion, that stuff was really insightful. That really helped me understand the how. That's the thing that people don't know. I mean, people will improve if you tell them how to do it. So,
if you or your employees are still focused on fixing their weaknesses, consider how you might incorporate building a strength-based approach. Experiment with using our Competency Companion Development Guide for your leadership development efforts. To receive a sample companion development guide on one competency, just complete the survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. Now, if by some chance it doesn't pop up, let me give you the address that you might enter. It is lowercase bit.ly/lowercase zfoct19. Again, lowercase bit.ly/zf lowercase oct19, and you will have access to this Competency Companion Development Guide that will display one competency with its companion behaviors and developmental recommendations. Just a final word. Mahatma Gandhi said a very interesting thing, that man often becomes what he believes himself to be. If I keep on saying it to myself, I cannot do a certain thing. It is possible that I may end up by really becoming incapable of doing it. On the other hand, if I have the belief that I can do it, I shall surely acquire the capacity to do it, even if I may not have it at the beginning. What we love about that quotation from Gandhi is that he really kind of expresses that sentiment that we strongly have, and that is a strength is not something I was always born with. It isn't a talent or capacity that I acquired at a very young age. One that I choose can be developed. It It can be driven by what the organization needs me to do or what I'm just particularly interested in acquiring. We thank you for your participation and involvement on today's webinar and invite you to kind of contact us if what we've said today kind of piques your interest. Many thanks.
Right.